Let's just dive right into this. Welcome to today's Explainer. We're looking at one of the absolute most chilling and frankly baffling cold cases in all of maritime history. We're going to unpack a mystery that has remained completely unsolved for over 125 years. Seriously, it's a story of brutal isolation, extreme elements, and a disappearance so incredibly sudden and complete that it just totally defies logic. Now, to really set the scene here, picture the harsh, super isolated Flannam Isles out in the North Atlantic. Locals actually call them the Seven Hunters. They're this group of tiny, uninhabited rocky islands off the western coast of Scotland. Historically, shepherds would bring their flocks out here because the grass supposedly had these miraculous healing properties. But, and this is a huge detail, they would never stay the night. There was this deep-rooted superstition that when darkness fell, something else woke up on these islands. But of course, in 1899, humanity tried to conquer that darkness by building a massive lighthouse. Fast forward just 1 year to December 26, 1900, when a relief ship arrives to find an eerie, dead silence. 3 keepers had vanished without a single trace.
Moving on to part 1, the discovery. What's really fascinating here is how the clues immediately start pointing to something completely unnatural from the very moment that silence was noticed.
So there's this absolutely critical 11-day window where the lighthouse just went dark. On midnight of December 15th, a steamship named the Arctur was passing by and its captain noticed, hey, there's no light. But because of a total chain of negligence, that critical piece of information literally never reached the Northern Lighthouse Board. It wasn't until December 26th that the relief ship, the Hesperus, finally arrived. Captain James Harvey immediately noticed there was no flag on the mast, which was the standard daily signal that everything was okay with the keepers. He honked the ship's massive horn. Nothing. Just the sound of the ocean crashing. He fired a signal flare. Still, absolutely no response.
When the relief keeper, Joseph Moore, finally stepped ashore and went inside, he didn't find a chaotic scene. There were no signs of panic or struggle. Instead, it was like a frozen moment in time. The outer doors were firmly locked, but oddly, the kitchen door was left wide open. The air inside was completely cold and stale, like no one had taken a breath there and there for days. All the clocks had just stopped. The beds were empty, but they were perfectly made and tidy, almost as if the men had woken up, started their day, and simply evaporated. But here's the most glaring anomaly: the lighthouse lamp itself. Moore found it perfectly cleaned, totally filled with oil, and completely ready to light for the evening. The men had fully prepped it, they just never got the chance to strike the match.
Let's look at part 2, the missing keepers. Because you have to wonder, right? Who exactly were these 3 men that vanished into thin air?
Well, as you can see, these were definitely not amateurs who would just make some foolish rookie mistake. James Ducat, the principal keeper, had 2 solid decades of experience. He knew the ocean and all its terrifying moods intimately, and he was highly regarded for being incredibly calm and practical. Then you have Donald MacArthur, a temporary replacement brought in for a sick colleague. MacArthur was famous for his strict, firm, and incredibly tough temperament. He was not a guy who scared easily. Finally, Thomas Marshall was the youngest at 28, acting as the second assistant. These were hardened, highly disciplined men working in an environment where sticking to a routine was literally a matter of life and death.
Which brings us to a massively crucial point. When Moore searched the living quarters, he found Donald MacArthur's heavy winter overcoat still hanging right on its peg. Think about that for a second. In the freezing, whipping December winds of northern Scotland, a highly experienced, famously tough guy leaves the lighthouse without his heavy coat? No way. That wasn't just simple carelessness. That implies a blindingly fast exit. Something pulled or called him outside so urgently that he didn't even have a single second to grab his cold weather gear.
Now, in part 3, let's head outside to the West Landing, because the physical destruction there paints a terrifyingly violent picture.
While the inside of the lighthouse was pristine, the physical evidence outside told a completely different story. Just look at this number, 110. That represents the height in feet above the churning sea where a heavy iron lifebuoy was violently ripped right off its moorings. To really put that into perspective, that's roughly the height of a 10-storied building.
The sheer scale of the destruction way up at that elevation points to an unimaginable physical force. A heavy iron storage box they used for ropes and tools, completely gone, missing. Thick, heavy-duty ropes were scattered all across the rocks. Heavy iron railings were literally bent and completely uprooted right out of the solid stone. And the ropes holding that lifebuoy we just mentioned, they weren't cut with a knife. They were violently snapped by sheer immense force. It's almost as if some giant, invisible hand just swept the entire cliffside clean.
So the outside suggests a natural disaster, but Part 4, the haunting logbook, reveals something much darker was happening in the minds of the men inside. Investigators found a slate with notes for December 14th and 15th, and it actually stops mid-sentence. Honestly, reading this entry should give you chills. Remember the personalities we just went over? This log entry tells us that the highly practical 20-year veteran James Ducacott went totally silent, and MacArthur, the famously strict, tough guy who literally never showed weakness, was reduced to crying. It culminated in all three men doing the only thing they felt they could: praying. These deeply experienced men were utterly, completely broken by terror.
But here is the most unsettling anomaly of the entire mystery. The logbook repeatedly mentioned that the men were terrified by a colossal, highly destructive storm over those few days. But get this, literally 0 other weather stations in the entire region recorded a storm during that time. None. The skies were documented as totally clear and the weather was relatively calm. So either a localized freak hurricane battered only this tiny speck of rock in the ocean, or the storm they were experiencing wasn't meteorological at all.
Which brings us to the final entry, recorded at 9 a.m. on the morning of December 15th. It says, "The storm ended and the sea is calm," leaving us with a peaceful yet utterly haunting final thought before the slate just abruptly stops. It's literally as if the writer put the pen down mid-thought and the men simply ceased to exist.
This brings us to Part 5, the negligent watcher. Because what if I told you that someone on the mainland actually knew something was terribly wrong long before that rescue ship arrived?
The tragedy is actually compounded by a really shocking failure of duty. 18 miles away at Gallon Head, a gamekeeper named Roderick Mackenzie was paid £8 a year specifically to monitor the lighthouse every single night. If anything looked even slightly abnormal, he was supposed to immediately send a telegram to headquarters in Edinburgh. While Mackenzie later admitted to investigators that he saw absolutely no light from December 7th to December 29th, with the exception of one brief moment on the 12th. He even admitted he was worried, yet he waited over 2 weeks in total silence without sending a single message. The Northern Lighthouse Board later noted this fatal delay could have severely hindered an early rescue. And in a tragic twist of irony, James Ducacott had actually proposed testing emergency mainland signals before this assignment, but the board had rejected his idea. Crazy, right?
Moving into Part 6, let's start weighing the theories. After over a century of fierce debate, what actually happened to these men?
With all this weird physical and psychological evidence, let's systematically break down the theories that investigators and historians have been arguing over. First up is probably the most scientifically plausible answer: a giant rogue wave. Decades later, another keeper at this exact same lighthouse documented waves reaching up to 300 feet. So that perfectly explains the bent iron and missing ropes 110 feet up. Maybe a wave took some equipment, 2 men went out to secure it, a second wave hit, and MacArthur ran out without his coat to help, only for all 3 to get swept away. Makes sense, right? But it utterly fails to explain why 3 incredibly cautious veterans would stand near the cliff edge together during severe weather. Plus, the sea almost always returns something, right? A piece of clothing, a boot, a body. In this case, it returned absolutely nothing.
So, the second major theory is a complete psychological breakdown. We know from the log that their morale was entirely shattered, and MacArthur had an aggressive temper. So did the intense isolation and these phantom storms drive them to madness? Did it result in a fatal fight where bodies were thrown into the sea? Well, it's a really dark thought. But if the isolation broke their minds and caused a brawl, those completely tidy, perfectly undisturbed rooms we talked about earlier make this highly improbable. Seriously, there wasn't a single drop of blood or even an overturned chair in the entire lighthouse.
And when science and logic fail, human nature inevitably turns to myth. In the Outer Hebrides, locals blamed entities they call the Blue Men of the Minch, or Storm Kelpies. These are ancient mythological creatures said to live deep in the unfathomable depths of the ocean, conjuring localized unnatural storms just to drown sailors. Obviously, it's not a scientific explanation, but it beautifully highlights how communities use folklore as a cultural coping mechanism to process a tragedy that simply does not make any logical sense.
Building on that whole supernatural vibe, there's another fascinating local legend. It claims that as Joseph Moore first stepped onto the island from the relief ship, he saw 3 massive black birds suddenly take flight from the roof of the lighthouse, just disappearing into the northern sky. It's a poetic, really heartbreaking way for the community to symbolize the souls of the departed keepers leaving their post for good.
Finally, Part 7. So what should we take away from this enduring mystery that's been completely unsolved since 1900?
I mean, what do we actually do with all these scattered clues, the missing coats, shattered iron, and ghostly logbooks? The lighthouse actually continued to be manned for another 70 years, and some later keepers claimed they would occasionally hear the names James, Donald, and Thomas whispering in the wind. Despite modern technology eventually leading to the lighthouse's full automation in 1971, the mystery remains exactly as it was. The official government inquiry concluded the men were swept away by, quote, unusual marine conditions. Honestly, it remains a super convenient excuse that satisfies absolutely no one who looks closely at the evidence.
Today, there are literally no human voices on the Flannam Isles. Just a machine, automatically sweeping its light across the dark Atlantic every single night. And as it does, we are left to wonder, did three highly experienced men simply misjudge a freak wave? Or are there still ancient, terrifying secrets hidden in the freezing cold waters of the Seven Hunters?